Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 5 seasons of Game of Thrones. So recently, with the end of season 5, I've watched a lot of videos and read a lot of reviews where people mention what their favorite or least favorite seasons of Game of Thrones are thus far. So I thought I'd make a video about what my favorite and least favorite seasons of Game of Thrones are. So I will count down my top 5 favorite seasons out of the 5 seasons we have thus far. In addition, I will also rate each season with my usual scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst, 10 being the best. And as you will soon see, I think really highly of the show as a whole. And in my mind, there is no such thing as a bad season of Game of Thrones, as every season is great in its own right. So spoiler warning for the first 5 seasons of Game of Thrones. So we'll start off with my number 5 and thus least favorite season, which is season 3. I recently rewatched the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones just before season 5 aired, and this one to me was by far my least favorite and the one I was least interested in watching again, as it's filled to the brim with the most filler out of any season and is the most slow paced. There were 2 major events in this season that really made it really great, and that is Daenerys' classic sacking of Astapor and the Red Wedding. And there was also a lot of great moments this season, as it saw the introduction of one of the show's most intriguing characters, Lady Olenna. This was also the first year I felt really highly of Jon Snow and the Wall storyline in the first 2 seasons. They were my least favorite storylines in the show, whereas this year it was one of the best, with Jon Snow and Ygritte romance working really well, showing he was torn between 2 worlds. And of course this was a great year for the Khaleesi, as she acquired more loyal followers and vast armies to boot. However, this was my least favorite year for King's Landing, as Tyrion wasn't nearly as interesting being a whipping boy this year as he was kicking ass as the Hand of the King in the previous season. Plus, as I mentioned, this storyline was filled to the brim with slow-moving filler about who's going to marry whom, with not enough intrigue to keep me invested that every other season has. Also, I was not as impressed as everyone else seems to be with the Jaime and Brienne duo, as Jaime's sudden change in character felt really fake and forced to me. And then there was Theon's storyline, which was incredibly boring. Every time he was on screen, I was just counting the minutes until he left again. Bran's storyline, as usual, was boring, and this year featured the clunky introduction of Jojen and Mira, which wasn't handled nearly as well as it was in the books. And although I loved the Red Wedding, Robb Stark's storyline was mostly just build up to that event without anything else really happening. Overall, it seemed most of the season was hanging on the Red Wedding, and it seems an odd choice to me to make a centerpiece of a season be an event that kills off some of our most beloved characters, and the quote-unquote villains of the show seem to win yet again. But as always, season 3 featured that same magic that Game of Thrones spectacularly has every year, so my rating for season 3 is a 7, very good. Next, on to my number 4, which is season 1. Season 1, as I mentioned before, didn't even strike me as that great for the first half of the season, and didn't really start to garnish my attention until like episode 6. And it was not the first season that really got me to love the show. And even on a rewatch, the first half of season 1 is probably my least favorite part of this series to watch again, as it takes a long time to get going. A lot of the events in Winterfell I found only mildly interesting, where I was bored to tears with Jon Snow's storyline and the Tournament of the Hand. And even Daenerys took a while to get going. But once things started to kick in the second half of the season, that's when things started getting really good. Tyrion showed off his true colors as a witty, unforgettable character worthy of being a fan favorite at the trial at the Eyrie. Dany and Drogo's adventures started to heat up when they finally ditched the annoying brother But most of all, the intrigue in King's Landing was at its finest as Ned worked to unravel what plots were about in the city while facing danger from every corner. I'll always point to the moment when I first realized the show was great, when Ned Stark went to arrest Cersei and to assume the position of Protector of the Realm. You see, at this stage, I knew nothing about the books or the nature of the show being totally different from any other show, and I was still looking at it the way I would look at any other TV show. And in any other TV show, Ned would arrest Cersei and assume his role, and the wacky weekly adventures would continue from there. So when Littlefinger pulled the knife on him as his men were being slaughtered all around him, that's when I first realized this was something totally different than anything I've seen before. And of course, this realization only deepened when Ned Stark lost his head and Daenerys walked out of the fire with 3 baby dragons. So the second half of the season was truly special, but the dullness of the first half held it back a little bit from me. Plus, it didn't feature as many different and diverse storylines as later seasons did, and focused a bit too much on Ned. So my rating for season 1 is a 9, excellent. Coming in at number 3 is season 5. When I was talking about season 3, I mentioned how the only 2 great moments in season 3 was Dany's sacking of Astapor and the Red Wedding. Well, season 5 had 2 events that rivaled those events that were the best events in the entire season for season 3. Season 5 had those great events in a single episode. That's Drogon's spectacular attack in the fighting pits and the tragic burning of Shireen. And that's just one episode. This season was loaded with many other epic events, none the least being the horrifying White Walker attack at Hardhome, which is one of the best, if not the best, battle sequence in the entire series. In addition to these 2 awesome action pieces, we also got some great dramatic intrigue with Cersei's storyline in King's Landing, where she was engaged in a battle of wits with Marjorie, one in which she seemed to win until Lady Olenna and Littlefinger used their combined scheming power to turn it on Cersei, who for the first time in 5 seasons fell from grace and fell hard, leading to the Walk of Shame scene where Cersei was truly humiliated. And if that wasn't enough, on top of that, we got Arya's epic conclusion to her training as she was striving all season long to abandon her identity and become no one, but was unable to resist the temptation when coming to face with the man on her kill list. So instead, she abandoned her training in a gruesome Tarantino-esque scene, and then faced the consequences in a real trippy scene that showed once and for all that the Faceless Men truly are no one. And on top of that, we got Stannis' downfall as he started the season as a man on top who single-handedly defeated the Wildlings, but slowly fell from grace as Melisandre's magic and prophecies betrayed them, and it ended up having the opposite effect of what she had promised. With all these great storylines and epic adventures, it seems like this should be at the top of my list. But, unfortunately, in addition to featuring some of the best moments of the series, it also featured some of the worst, as Jaime's wacky adventures in Dorne was pretty much the worst storyline the show has ever done, as it introduced a whole slew of new characters but failed to give them enough screen time to make them interesting, and relied on cheap comic relief instead of great storytelling, and it squandered the great source material by turning it into an overly simplistic story lacking the dynamic it should have had. In addition, Brienne's storyline is also in the running for worst of the series, as she spent half the season waiting around for a signal she wasn't even there to see, rendering all the time we spent with her this season completely pointless. Sansa was also a bit wasted this season. Instead of seeing her becoming a major player and squaring off against Ramsay, she becomes a victim that needs to be saved by Theon. Also, Jon Snow's tragic fall from grace from the books also wasn't pulled off as well, as the show removed a lot of elements that made that storyline dynamic and replaced it with a one-bit storyline about Ollie, and they foreshadowed that to death. So, This may be one of the most polarized seasons of the show, featuring some of the greatest moments and some of the worst moments, so having it in the middle of my countdown seems like the perfect place for it. So my rating for Season 5 is a 9 excellent. Coming in at number 2 is Season 2, which I could just as easily call a tie for my number 1, as Season 2 could also be called my favorite season of the series, and it was the season that first got me to love the show. Season 2 features some of my favorite storylines of the entire series. First and foremost is Tyrion's stint as Hand of the King, which may well be my favorite storyline of the show, period. Tyrion gets into a situation where everyone's acting all smug and comfortable, and he just shakes things up. He starts by slapping Joffrey around and stopping him from torturing Sansa and other of his stupid shenanigans. He outwits Cersei at every turn by turning her consort into his own personal spy. He sends the despicable Jaina Slynt to the wall, throws the lonesome Maester Pycelle in the Black Cells, and even puts Varys and Littlefinger in their places. And if all that wasn't enough, it ends in the most epic battle sequence where Tyrion is forced to become the unexpected hero. And on top of that, we were also given many other awesome storylines that nearly rivaled this one, including the War of the Five Kings, where Stannis and Renly feud over power of the Stormlands, and Robb Stark continues to win victory after victory, even after encountering a distraction. The word amazing is a vast understatement when talking about Arya's storyline, as she gets an assassin's version of a genie, Jaqen H'ghar, who offers her 3 deaths of her choice. And on top of that, we get some of the best character interactions ever when Tywin and Arya have witty conversations as she serves as his cupbearer. In addition to that, we get an excellent, well-constructed, and intense storyline with Daenerys, as she must struggle to survive in a strange city and deal with a deceptive liar who pretends to be her friend but is really her foe, as he conspires with a group of magical warlocks to steal her dragons, making this one of my favorite Dany storylines of the entire series. However, the 2 storylines that hold this season back a little bit for me and prevent it from being number 1 is Theon and Bran's adventures in Winterfell, which wasn't pulled off as well as it could have been, as Theon came off as far more idiotic than he did in the books, and the ending was so confusing it angered me. And Jon Snow's storyline, where he totally came off as an incompetent idiot who got his friends killed. Not a good look, Jon Snow. So those 2 storylines held it back ever so slightly for me. But for the most part, Season 2 was packed full of amazing moments and was the season where I first fell in love with the show, so my rating for Season 2 is a 10, the best. And my number 1 favorite season of Game of Thrones is Season 4. Season 4 is the season where everything just came together. Every other season has a couple of average episodes, several really good above average episodes, and 1 or 2 truly amazing episodes. Season 4 has 5 amazing episodes: The Lion and the Rose, The Laws of Gods and Men, The Mountain and the Viper, The Watchers on the Wall, and The Children. It also has 2 really good above average episodes, 2 Swords and Mockingbird, and 3 average episodes, Breaker of Chains, Oathkeeper, and First of His Name, which is far better than most seasons do. King's Landing was spectacular this year, with the great introduction of Oberyn Martell, who really shook things up in King's Landing, as well as the intense storyline with Joffrey's assassination and Tyrion being blamed for the murder, which led to some of the best performances of the entire series, and an intense ending with ups and downs as Oberyn is shockingly slain by the Mountain and Tyrion is sentenced to death but later escapes only to find his lover in his father's bed and kills them both. Truly a great story. And we also get epic showdowns between the Wildlings and the Night's Watch as this great attack looms over them. And when it comes, they barely survive and end up being saved by an unsuspected visit from Stannis. Even Bran's storyline was interesting for once, as he finally arrives at his destination only to be greeted by these scary as hell skeleton-looking zombie thingies that kill his friend and his guide Jojen. Even the storylines that weren't that great this year still had great moments, such as Daenerys, who didn't have the best season this year as she was mostly just spinning her wheels in Meereen, still had some great scenes such as her epic speech to the slaves of Meereen inciting rebellion, and her learning of the betrayal from Ser Jorah, which led to his exile, and finally the scene where she begrudgingly locks up her dragons was one of the few scenes in the entire show that actually had me in tears. Even the weakest storyline of the season, which by far was Arya's storylines as it had way too much unnecessary filler, had some great moments such as the confrontation with Pulliver at the end, which was one of my favorite scenes in the entire series, with the Hound's verbal sparring with Pulliver before the real sparring began was so intense, so awesome, as was seeing Arya take delight in scratching a name off her list. And then there was Ramsay and Reek's storyline, which had some fumbles like Yara taking on a Bolton army but running away from some dogs. But even that storyline had epic moments, such as the shaving scene where we learned just how brainwashed Theon really is. Most of the storylines this season were at its best and finest, but even the weak ones were balanced with a lot of epic moments. So my rating for Season 4 is a 10, the best. The momentum this season as a whole just worked really well, much better than any other season, making this my favorite season of Game of Thrones. So that's it for my top 5 seasons of Game of Thrones. Be sure to check out my channel for many other Game of Thrones videos, and make sure you subscribe to keep up with the future videos I'll be doing, and thanks a lot for watching.